The health department said the food poisoning outbreak was an isolated incident, no evidence of systematic violations or cover-ups. What they didn't know was that the answer was serving lunch from a food truck downtown, recognizing health code fraud through the eyes of someone who had spent over a decade investigating restaurants that prioritized profit over public safety. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of food safety vigilance and protecting public health, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The downtown food truck plaza operated Monday through Friday from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., transforming a vacant lot into a bustling outdoor food court where office workers, tourists, and students could choose from a dozen different mobile kitchens, serving everything from Korean BBQ to gourmet grilled cheese. The location was perfect for quick lunch breaks, offering variety, affordability, and the kind of casual dining experience that made people feel connected to their community's culinary culture. Carlos Mendez parked his truck, Mendez Mobile Kitchen, in the same spot every day, serving authentic Mexican street food with the kind of consistency that had built a loyal customer base over 3 years of operation. At 61, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired restaurant manager who had decided to pursue his passion for cooking by starting his own mobile food business. But Carlos's attention to food safety protocols went far beyond normal health code compliance. While most food truck operators focused on speed, flavor, and customer service, Carlos automatically monitored temperature controls, sanitation procedures, and storage practices with the trained eye of someone who understood that food service violations could be symptoms of much larger criminal operations. What his customers didn't know was that Carlos Mendez had never been a restaurant manager. For 14 years, he'd been Senior Health Inspector Carlos Mendez, Department of Public Health, specializing in food service fraud, deliberate contamination cases, and investigations where restaurants used health code violations to cover financial crimes including tax evasion, insurance fraud, and money laundering operations that used food poisoning outbreaks to explain suspicious business losses. His retirement 3 years ago had been planned. His instinct for recognizing food safety fraud had been permanent. "Thanks, Carlos," said Janet Wilson, a regular customer from the accounting firm across the street. "Your food is always so consistent. I never have to worry about getting sick from your truck." "That's the idea," Carlos replied, but his attention was on the Soul Kitchen truck 2 spaces down, where he'd observed temperature violations, cross-contamination practices, and ingredient handling that violated basic food safety standards in ways that suggested deliberate negligence rather than ignorance. What bothered Carlos wasn't just the health code violations. During his inspector career, he'd seen plenty of restaurants that were simply sloppy or poorly managed. What concerned him was the pattern of violations combined with the business model that didn't make financial sense unless the truck was being used for purposes beyond legitimate food service. Over the next week, Carlos found himself conducting the kind of covert observation that had characterized his health department career. Not obvious surveillance, just the systematic documentation of practices that distinguished normal food service operations from criminal enterprises using food trucks as fronts. Soul Kitchen operated with health violations that should have resulted in immediate closure, yet somehow maintained permits and avoided health department scrutiny. The truck served food at prices below ingredient cost, accepted only cash payments, and had customer traffic that didn't match their actual food sales volume. Most concerning, Carlos recognized the specific types of contamination that could be used to deliberately cause food poisoning outbreaks that would justify insurance claims while covering financial irregularities. "Carlos," said Detective Maria Santos, approaching his truck during the lunch rush, "have you heard about the food poisoning outbreak last week? 12 people hospitalized from various food trucks downtown. Carlos had been following the news coverage, which described the outbreak as an isolated incident caused by seasonal temperature fluctuations and coincidental sanitation failures across multiple vendors. "Terrible situation," Carlos said, serving Detective Santos her usual chicken taco while his trained mind processed the statistical impossibility of simultaneous food safety failures across multiple unrelated food service operations. That evening, Carlos did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He called a number that connected him to people who still investigated the kinds of crimes he'd once specialized in preventing. Health Department Fraud Division, Inspector Angela Rodriguez speaking. "Angela, this is Carlos Mendez." There was a pause. "Carlos? How's the food truck business?" "Educational," Carlos said, sitting at his kitchen table with business observations and photographs that looked like normal vendor documentation but represented potential evidence of systematic health department corruption. "Angela, I need to report suspected food service fraud involving coordinated health code violations." Inspector Rodriguez had worked with Carlos for 6 years before his retirement. She knew that when Carlos Mendez called about suspected food service fraud, it meant discovering criminal operations that threatened public health for financial gain. "What are you seeing?" Carlos provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in health department investigations. Violation patterns, business model inconsistencies, contamination indicators, and corruption signs that suggested coordinated food safety fraud rather than isolated health code violations. "Carlos," Rodriguez said after he finished, "will coordinate with financial crimes and public corruption units. Can you maintain normal operations while we develop the investigation?" "Affirmative," Carlos said, "but based on the contamination patterns and business cycle, they're planning another outbreak to coincide with the insurance claim processing from last week's incident." What happened next was 14 years of health department investigation expertise compressed into the most important food service operation of Carlos's civilian life. He returned to the food truck plaza the following Monday, not just as a vendor selling authentic Mexican food, but as an experienced investigator conducting surveillance in an environment where criminals thought their health code fraud was invisible among legitimate food service violations. Over the next 2 weeks, Carlos documented evidence of systematic health department corruption involving deliberate contamination, fraudulent insurance claims, and bribery operations that allowed dangerous food service practices to continue while generating profits from manufactured food poisoning outbreaks. "We've arrested 8 suspects, including 2 health department officials," Rodriguez told him during a briefing at his truck after the operation concluded. The fraud network was generating over $500,000 annually through coordinated food poisoning outbreaks that triggered insurance claims while covering money laundering operations. "Public health impact assessment?" Carlos asked. "Over 200 people hospitalized in the past 18 months from deliberately contaminated food served by trucks that should have been shut down immediately. Your identification of the pattern prevented what could have been a fatal outbreak designed to generate maximum insurance payout." The investigation revealed that the health code fraud network had been operating for over 2 years, systematically bribing health department officials while using food trucks as fronts for financial crimes that prioritized profit over the safety of people who trusted street food vendors to provide safe meals. Local news covered the story as a major public health fraud bust by health department authorities, with no mention of the food truck owner who had recognized the violation patterns or the health department veteran who had provided the expertise that protected hundreds of people from deliberate food poisoning. A few weeks later, the city's food service licensing department approached Carlos about developing enhanced safety protocols for mobile food vendors. "Mr. Mendez," said Food Service Director Robert Kim, "we understand you have extensive experience in food safety management?" Carlos looked around the food truck plaza where families were enjoying safe street food, workers were grabbing quick lunches they could trust, and vendors were operating legitimate businesses without being exploited by criminal networks. "Some," he said simply, "we'd like to implement stronger oversight procedures to prevent future health code fraud. Would you be willing to consult on developing those protocols?" "Of course," Carlos replied. "Food safety is everyone's responsibility, especially when it comes to protecting people who trust food service operators to prioritize health over profit." What the food service director didn't know was that he'd just asked one of the region's most experienced food safety fraud investigators to design security systems for protecting food truck operations from exactly the kind of health code corruption Carlos had spent his career fighting. Carlos never told his customers about his health department background or the food service fraud networks he'd dismantled. He never mentioned the deliberate contamination cases he'd investigated or the restaurant owners he'd prosecuted for using food poisoning as a cover for financial crimes. He just operated his food truck every day, served safe and delicious meals, and quietly watched for health code violations that indicated criminal operations were using food service as a front for fraud and money laundering. But word spread through food safety circles that if anyone noticed unusual health code violations or suspicious food service practices, they should probably consult with the owner of Mendez Mobile Kitchen. Not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how food service fraud operations worked. Every Monday through Friday from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., Carlos continued his routine. He served authentic Mexican food, maintained the highest health safety standards, and monitored the food truck plaza with the kind of vigilant observation that had kept him at the forefront of food safety investigation for over a decade. Most days, the biggest challenge was managing lunch rush orders and keeping ingredients fresh in changing weather conditions. But some days, when his trained instincts detected health code violations that threatened public safety, Carlos Mendez was exactly where he needed to be, between innocent customers and food service criminals who would poison people for profit. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career investigating food safety fraud. You don't stop when you retire. You just find a new way to protect people from restaurants and food trucks that prioritize criminal profit over public health. And sometimes the most sophisticated food safety monitoring in a community is provided by someone who looks like they're just trying to serve great tacos at reasonable prices. Carlos had spent 14 years investigating food service operations that deliberately sickened customers to cover financial crimes. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one food truck plaza remained a place where people could enjoy street food without being poisoned by criminal enterprises disguised as legitimate businesses. The mission was the same. The food service was the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating food safety crimes after people were hospitalized, he was preventing contamination before criminals could harm innocent customers. And every day, as office workers and tourists enjoyed safe, delicious meals from food trucks they trusted, Carlos Mendez worked with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between legitimate food service violations and criminal contamination operations, ready to protect both the customers and the food service community that depended on public trust. So the next time you buy lunch from a food truck, remember that the person cooking your meal might have expertise far beyond culinary skills. The vendor ensuring your food is safe might be the same person who spent their career investigating food service operations that would poison customers for financial gain. Have you ever met someone like Carlos? Someone whose retirement business perfectly positioned them to protect public health using their professional expertise? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop ensuring that the food we trust is actually safe to eat. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting public health from food service fraud. Because the world needs more people like Carlos Mendez, professionals who understand that some protection is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear health department badges and investigate food safety violations. Sometimes they operate food trucks and watch for contamination patterns. But they're always protecting people from food service criminals, always ensuring that street food remains safe rather than a weapon used by those who would poison customers for profit. And sometimes the most important food safety in your neighborhood comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how food service fraud works and refuses to let it operate in any community he serves.